What happened in the next few minutes shook Jerusalem to its foundations, literally. The massive curtain hanging inside the temple, a thick woven fabric 60 feet tall, separating the outer courts from the Holy of Holies, was torn in two from top to bottom, not from the bottom up, as if a human hand had grabbed it, from top to bottom, as if something from above had ripped it open. The earth shook, rocks split. The Roman centurion standing at the foot of the cross, a hardened soldier who had seen men die before, a man with no religious stake in any of this, looked up and said, "Surely this man was the Son of God." The crowd beat their chests and walked away in silence. Something heavy and solemn had settled over the city. As evening approached, a man named Joseph of Arimathea went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. With him came Nicodemus, bringing 75 pounds of myrrh and aloes. Together they took Jesus down from the cross, wrapped him in linen with the spices, and laid him in a new tomb carved from rock in a nearby garden. They rolled a large stone across the entrance. The religious leaders asked Pilate to seal the tomb and post guards. The stone was sealed. The guards were posted. Saturday passed in silence. The disciples stayed hidden. The women stayed home. Jerusalem moved through the day as if underwater, stunned, grieving, uncertain. And then, very early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb. But that is a story for another day. Why does this story matter? Why 20 centuries later do billions of people around the world pause each year to remember these events? Because the story of the crucifixion speaks the language of the deepest human questions. What do we do with guilt, with failure, with the knowledge that we have hurt people we love and fallen short of who we were meant to be? The cross says, it has been dealt with. Someone carried it. The debt has been paid. What do we do with suffering? The cross says, God is not untouched by your pain. He did not watch human suffering from a safe distance. He entered it. He wore it. He screamed under the weight of it on a Friday afternoon outside Jerusalem. What do we do with death? The cross says, this is not the end. The stone is never the last word. Jesus of Nazareth was not a man who happened to be crucified. He was a man who chose it, who walked toward it with clear eyes, who in the middle of it forgave the people doing it to him, who with his last breath committed himself into the hands of his Father. That is not the death of a victim. That is the death of someone who knew exactly what he was doing and did it anyway for love. The crucifixion of Jesus Christ is the story of what love, real love, is actually willing to do, and on the third day, everything changed.
The crowd chose Barabbas. Pilate called for a basin of water. He washed his hands before the crowd and said, I am innocent of this man's blood. This is your responsibility. It was a gesture of cowardice dressed up as symbolism. He knew Jesus was innocent, but political convenience mattered more to him than justice. He released Barabbas. He handed Jesus over to be flogged and crucified. The flogging alone was sometimes fatal. The Roman flagellum was a short whip with multiple leather thongs, each embedded with pieces of bone and metal. By the time the soldiers were done, Jesus was barely recognizable. Then the soldiers gathered around him and mocked him. They put a scarlet robe on him, twisted thorns into a crown, and forced it onto his head, put a staff in his hand, and knelt before him. Hail, King of the Jews. They spat on him. They struck his head again and again, driving the thorns deeper. When they were finished, they placed the heavy wooden crossbeam on his shredded shoulders and led him out through the city gates. The procession moved through Jerusalem's streets, the road that tradition calls the Via Dolorosa, the way of suffering. Some wept openly, some hurled insults, some watched in numb, helpless silence. Jesus stumbled and fell. The soldiers pulled a man from the crowd, Simon of Cyrene, a visitor from North Africa, and forced him to carry the cross behind Jesus. There is something quietly profound about this, the most significant burden in human history, carried for a stretch by an ordinary stranger who had no idea why he was there. Women lined the road, weeping. Jesus stopped and turned to them. Daughters of Jerusalem, don't weep for me. Weep for yourselves and for your children. Even bleeding and barely able to stand, his concern was for others. The procession climbed the final rocky path and arrived at Golgotha, the place of the skull, a low hill just outside the city walls, near a main road, chosen so that executions here would be seen by the maximum number of people. They offered Jesus wine mixed with myrrh, a mild painkiller. He refused it. He would face what was coming with a clear mind. And then they crucified him. The soldiers laid the crossbeam on the ground. Jesus was pushed down onto it. Large iron spikes were driven through his wrists into the wood. The crossbeam was lifted and fixed to the upright post. His feet were crossed and a single spike was driven through them both. The cross dropped into its socket. The jolt sent shockwaves of pain through every wound. Two criminals were crucified alongside him. Above his head, a sign read in 3 languages, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. The religious leaders mocked him. He saved others, but he can't save himself. Even one of the criminals crucified beside him joined in the taunting. But the other criminal rebuked him. He said, "Don't you fear God. We are getting what we deserve. But this man has done nothing wrong." Then he turned to Jesus and said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus, in pain beyond imagination, said, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." In the final hours of his life, Jesus was still saving people. Standing at the foot of the cross was his mother Mary, the woman who had held him as a baby in Bethlehem, now watching her son die. And there was nothing she could do. Jesus looked down and saw her. Beside her stood John, the one disciple who had not run. Jesus said to his mother, "Woman, here is your son." And to John, "Here is your mother." Even dying, he was making sure the people he loved would be cared for. At noon, the brightest hour of the day, the sky went dark, not a passing cloud. The Gospels say darkness fell over all the land and lasted 3 hours. Ancient historians outside the Bible also recorded an unusual darkness during this period in Judea. For 3 hours, the cross stood in darkness. Then, near 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, my God, why have you forsaken me?" These are perhaps the most haunting words in all of human literature. He was not losing his faith. He was expressing the full depth of what he was carrying, the experience of divine abandonment that is the consequence of human sin. He was bearing all of it, every last piece of it. Someone soaked a sponge in wine vinegar and held it up to his lips. Jesus took it. Then he said, "It is finished." In the original Greek, those 3 words are a single word, tetelestai, a word used in the ancient world to mark an account fully paid, a debt cleared, a task completed, not "it is over," not "I give up," "it is finished, the work is done." Then Jesus called out, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." And he bowed his head and he died. Jesus asked 8 of his disciples to sit and wait near the entrance. Then he took Peter, James, and John, his 3 closest friends, deeper into the garden, and something shifted in him. The Gospels describe it with striking, almost clinical honesty. Jesus became deeply distressed and troubled. He said to them, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here, keep watch." Then he walked a little further on alone. He fell to the ground and he began to pray, "Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me, yet not my will, yours be done." This prayer has stopped theologians, philosophers, and ordinary people in their tracks for 2,000 years. Because what we are witnessing here is not weakness. It is the full weight of what Jesus was about to carry, pressing down on his fully human soul. He knew what was coming, not just the physical horror of crucifixion, but something far deeper. He was about to take upon himself the accumulated sin, guilt, and brokenness of every human being who had ever lived or would ever live. The separation from God that human sin creates, he was about to experience that separation fully, completely alone. The Gospel of Luke tells us that his sweat became like drops of blood falling to the ground. This is a documented medical phenomenon called hematidrosis. It occurs under conditions of extreme psychological stress, when tiny blood vessels near the sweat glands rupture and mix blood with sweat. Jesus was not performing. He was not exaggerating. He was experiencing genuine, profound human anguish. He prayed 3 times. Each time he returned to find his disciples asleep. Each time he woke them gently. He understood their exhaustion. He did not condemn them. But there was a loneliness in those hours in the garden that is almost unbearable to think about. And then, suddenly, the silence of the garden was broken. Torchlight. Dozens of torches flickering through the trees. The sound of armed men moving through the olive grove. Temple guards. Roman soldiers. And at the front of the group, walking with a purpose that was also a kind of agony, Judas. Jesus stood up. He did not run. He walked forward to meet them. Judas approached him, and he greeted Jesus with a kiss, a prearranged signal. The guards moved in immediately, grabbing Jesus and binding his hands. Peter, always impulsive, drew a sword and swung it, cutting off the ear of the high priest's servant. Jesus immediately reached out and healed the man. Even in the moment of his own arrest, he was still healing, still restoring, still refusing to meet violence with violence. He looked at the crowd of armed men and said, "Am I leading a rebellion that you have come with swords and clubs? Every day I was with you in the temple courts, and you did not arrest me there. But this is your hour. This is when darkness reigns." The disciples ran, every one of them. They scattered into the darkness of the olive garden and disappeared. Jesus stood alone in the torchlight, surrounded by his enemies, hands bound, and he walked willingly with them back toward the city. What followed was one of the most grotesquely unjust legal proceedings proceedings in recorded history. Jesus was brought first to the house of Annas, the former high priest and the most powerful figure in the Jewish religious establishment. Then he was taken to Caiaphas, the current high priest, where the Sanhedrin had gathered in the middle of the night for an emergency session. Trial by night was illegal under Jewish law. Witnesses were brought in to testify against Jesus, but their stories contradicted each other. Finally, the high priest stood up and asked Jesus directly, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" And Jesus answered, "I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power, coming on the clouds of heaven." Caiaphas tore his robes. He turned to the council. "What more do we need? You have heard the blasphemy. What is your verdict?" And they all condemned him as deserving death. What happened next was shameful. The members of the council began to spit in Jesus' face. They blindfolded him and struck him with their fists, mocking, "Prophesy, who hit you?" Meanwhile, in the courtyard outside, Peter had followed at a distance and was warming himself by a fire. 3 times he was recognized as a follower of Jesus. 3 times he denied it, the 3rd time with curses and oaths, swearing he had never known the man. And at that moment, a rooster crowed. Peter remembered. He went out into the dark and wept bitterly. It was the cry of a man who had just discovered the worst thing about himself. As morning came, Jesus was taken to Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor. Rome alone had the authority to carry out an execution. Pilate examined Jesus carefully. 3 times he tried to release him. He sent him to Herod, who mocked him and sent him back. He offered the crowd a choice, Jesus or Barabbas, a convicted murderer. Imagine you are standing in a crowd. The sun is blazing over your head. The air smells of dust, sweat, and blood. Around you, thousands of people are screaming. Some are weeping. Some are laughing. Some stand frozen, unable to look away, unable to look at what is happening in front of them. On a rocky hill, just outside the walls of Jerusalem, a man is dying. He is not a criminal. He is not a murderer. He has never raised a weapon, never stolen, never lied under oath. Every person who knew him closely said the same thing. He was unlike any man they had ever met. He healed the sick. He fed the hungry. He sat with the outcasts that everyone else ignored. Children ran to him. Broken people found peace near him. And now he is nailed to a cross. His back has been torn open by a Roman whip. A crown of twisted thorns has been crushed onto his skull. His hands and feet are pinned to rough wood by iron spikes. Every breath he takes requires him to push up against the nails, just to expand his lungs. Every breath is a choice to keep living a little longer in agony. And in the middle of all of this, in the middle of the worst pain a human body can experience, he opens his mouth and says something that stops the crowd cold. He says, "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they are doing." Not a curse, not a cry for revenge. Forgiveness for the very people killing him. Who was this man? What brought him to this hill? And why, 2,000 years later, does this moment still shake something deep inside the human soul? This is not just a religious story. This is the most consequential event in human history. Billions of lives have been shaped by what happened on that hill. Empires have risen and fallen in its wake. The entire calendar of the Western world was reset at the moment of his birth. And what he did in the last 24 hours of his life became the hinge on which all of history turns. His name was Jesus of Nazareth. And this is the story of his crucifixion. To understand what happened on that Friday morning, we have to go back to the night before, back to a small upper room in Jerusalem, lit by oil lamps, where 13 men sat together around a table for what would be their last meal together. It was Passover, the most sacred night in the Jewish calendar, a night that celebrated freedom, a night that remembered how God had delivered his people from slavery in Egypt. The lamb had been slaughtered, the bread had been broken, the wine had been poured. But Jesus, as he sat at the table that night, knew something his disciples did not. He knew exactly what was coming. He had known for months, and instead of running, instead of disappearing into the wilderness, as he easily could have, he had walked straight toward Jerusalem, straight toward the cross, because he had come to this earth for one reason, and that reason was tonight. He took the bread in his hands, he broke it, he looked at his disciples, these 12 men he had spent 3 years with, walking the roads of Galilee, sharing meals, watching them grow, and he said, "This is my body, it is broken for you, do this to remember me." Then he lifted the cup of wine, and he said, "This is my blood, the blood of a new covenant, poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." The disciples did not fully understand what he meant. They would not understand until it was over. But then Jesus said something that shattered the intimacy of the moment. He looked around the table at Peter, at John, at all of them, and he said quietly, "One of you sitting here with me right now is going to betray me tonight." The room went silent. Every man looked at the others. Every man looked at himself. One by one they asked, "Is it me, Lord? Is it me?" It was Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, a man who had walked with Jesus for 3 years, who had seen the miracles, who had heard every sermon, who had been trusted with the group's money. For 30 pieces of silver, the price you would pay for a common slave in that era, he had already made a deal with the religious leaders leaders to hand Jesus over. Jesus looked at Judas and he said, "What you are going to do it quickly." Judas stood up. He walked to the door. He stepped out into the darkness of the Jerusalem night, and the clock began to count down. After the meal, Jesus led his disciples out of the city, down through the Kidron Valley, and up the slope of the Mount of Olives to a garden called Gethsemane. The word Gethsemane means oil press, a place where olives were crushed to produce oil. It would prove to be a deeply fitting name for what happened there that night. The garden was old. The olive trees that stood there had gnarled, twisted trunks, their roots deep in the rocky hillside. On other nights, this had been a place of quiet retreat. Jesus had come here many times with his disciples to pray, but tonight was different.